Quentin Grafton, thank you very much for being with us here today. You gave a great talk earlier on here at the UNSW-ESCoE Economic Measurement Conference. You're talking about global human well-being. So what is global human well-being? How's it measured?
Well, you can measure it in multiple ways. A standard economic way of measuring it would be GDP, or gross domestic product per capita, adjusted for international prices, or you can measure it as a consumption measure, so that's a proportion of GDP. And you can also measure it in composite measures of human well-being that include other things other than income. So for example, education, life expectancy at birth, and then there are other measures that can broaden it out even further. And indeed, you can have a measure that's a survey measure. And there's a measure called the Life Evaluation Index, which is, they say, imagine your life is like a ladder, 0 to, well, I guess 1 to 10. And how would you rate your life, at the moment, 10 being the best? And so that's a self-reported type of measure of well-being. So there's multiple ways, multiple dimensions. And then if you're doing it at a global scale, you obviously have to have it at least a country level. You could even break it down into demographics within a country. We didn't do that. There's enough work with 155 countries data that we have that we do our analyses for. So that's essentially how you do it.
What did you find in your analysis? What's happening with global human well-being?
Well, I guess in some sense it won't be surprising to people who work in this space, but the results are somewhat different to what a lot of people would expect. So there's a common presumption that things will continue to get better for most of humanity. That's a standard kind of assumption. Most people have that point of view. There are some people who think that things could get really bad with climate change, etc. So there's a sort of two extreme points of view. We came at it by saying, well, what does the data tell us? And the data tells us a story that's not the standard extreme. And it tells the story that there are several flourishing countries. There's about 20 or so of these countries, and Australia is one of them, fortunately, which already have upper high income level status, so also have high levels of life expectancy at birth, and also have high levels of these composite measures of human well-being. They're not only high, but they're going to get even higher, according to our trend analysis, at least till past 2050. So if you want to group these countries, Australia, as I said, is one of them, 2025, then we call them flourishing countries. So it's just a really good news story. happy and lucky Australia. Unfortunately, that is not true at a global scale. So if we talk about global human well-being, it's not about what's happening in Australia or Norway, for example. It's what's happening at a global scale. And there are a bunch of countries, dozens and dozens of countries, where they are peaking in terms of their gross domestic product, or some income measure per capita, and life expectancy at birth. And some have already peaked, and there tends to be a geographical concentration, and that is in the African continent. Obviously, countries are very different in Africa, but there is certainly a geographical concentration in Africa, and there's some other places outside of Africa. And either peaked or are peaking between now and 2050, in the next 25 years. And they will peak at levels much less than the current levels of life expectancy at birth, and also gross domestic product per person that Australia currently enjoys in 2025. So not only will they peak, whilst Australia will continue to get better, according to our trend analysis, they'll peak at much, much lower levels. So that would tell us, the question that we asked in our work is average or global human well-being peaking, question mark? And the answer to that is, well, it depends where you are. But for most of the world, certainly for a little more than half the world's population, the answer is yes, it's peaking in the next 25 years. And for some countries, it's already peaked, according to the trend analysis. So that's what we find. So then if you want, you can have this flourishing countries, which includes Australia, and you can group this group called languishing countries, peaking at low levels in the next 25 years. And that's essentially the story. And then we put an overlay on top of that. So that's all historical trends. Then we put an overlay on that to 2050, the next 25 years, of course, one more generation in terms of climate change impacts, and look at that as something to consider in terms of whether global human well-being is peaking.
So how do your projections on climate change impact on the flourishing countries versus the languishing countries?
Well, all countries are worse off with climate change. It doesn't matter where you are, everyone's going to be worse off relative to not having climate change. So that's not a good news story for any country. However, the impacts are very different in the proportional context. So they're very different for two reasons. So first of all, if you just simply look at the impact on GDP or some measure of per capita income in 2050, the proportional impact is less, actually much less, on the upper higher income countries. It depends on the country, of course, geography matters here, but we're looking at somewhere between 3 to 5%, maybe 6%. Again, it depends. There's a range around that for the upper higher income countries. And if you look at the low income countries, which are less than $4,000 USD per capita, those range, again, it's highly variable. It's somewhere in the 10 to 15%. So the impacts are proportionally 3 to 5 times as much than the upper income. So the ones who are worse off, the languishing countries, are actually going to have bigger impacts. But you have to add a few other things onto that, because the upper higher income countries, and this point was made by David Gruen in the question time, those countries like Australia, they haven't peaked. The peak is coming sometimes after 2050. A 2 to 3 or 4, 5% impact on GDP in 2050 is not such a big deal relative to the fact that our incomes will be, per capita incomes, will be much higher in 2050, a lot higher. That's at least for Australia. But for those countries that are peaking or have peaked, well, that means they won't be higher. And so that proportional impact will be even worse. So the difference between the two sets of countries is really, really big. And in terms of an equity issue, obviously, you don't want to be in a languishing country that has a bigger impact with climate change, because you're low income, you're less able to adapt and respond to that. But also you've got this fact that you're not going to have the much higher income because you've got peaking GDP. So it puts it all together, makes it a challenging space to be a languishing country, a low income country in the wrong geography with climate change on top of this historical trend analysis. That leads to the point, well, what do you do about it? You just walk away and say, these are results, and go off and play golf. I don't play golf, by the way, but you have to respond to that, and so that our work also has a review of what possibly could be done to respond to this peaking global human well-being and these climate change impacts.
So you mentioned the possibility of cross-country transfers, where the flourishing countries could make a small contribution each and have a massive impact on the languishing countries. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so we looked at only countries that have per capita incomes in excess of 40,000 US dollars per person, and that includes Australia. But there are a bunch of other countries as well. So we just restricted to those very upper higher income countries, and we said what could be done if we had a transfer amount. And we have 3 different multiple transfers that we could offer, so we have multiple calculations. One is an aspirational target that was agreed to at the Conference of the Parties in terms of climate change a couple of years ago, and that's an aspirational target. And the other one that we used was climate change impacts. So the consequences on climate change as measured in projections that we have. And that is in excess of $1 trillion US. So proportional impacts 2 to 3% on the climate change from the upper income countries. That's 2 to 3%. So non-trivial, but not huge. For the benefiting countries, which are less than 4,000 US dollars, the impact is enormous. I just had a quick look at the numbers. 50%, could even be 100% of their current GDP. So they're very, very large transfers as a proportion of their economy. So there have to be some conditionality around it to make sure that the it gets spent in the right way, there's not crowding out, all of those sorts of things that and doesn't contribute to additional climate change, whatever. So that's a whole another story, but nevertheless, the impacts could be potentially enormous for the languishing countries, and for the upper income countries, small.
And it may avoid complications for the upper income countries from having mass migrations to deal with out of the languishing countries suffering from climate change and not being able to grow crops to feed their populations.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm now stepping out of the work. I'm now stepping into opinions. So the facts and the trends are so. But if I step out into speculation, or if you will, based on our work in this paper, but also other work and other work of other people, I think it's likely that people, certainly the poor and languishing countries, what they're going to have to face two possibilities, really. One is higher rates of mortality, probably substantially higher rates of mortality, or migration. So that's the response. If we don't change what we're currently doing, we can change what we're doing, but it's a mortality, excess mortality, or migration, both. And so what we're already seeing in Western Europe, we're seeing it in Australia, we're seeing it in other countries. Those countries that have high levels of income, they understand what is happening. This is not, in some sense, a big surprise what will happen or could happen under business as usual. They're starting to make investments in those countries where migration will come from, whether it's Western Europe and Northern Africa, or whether it's Australia and some of its near neighbors. Those sorts of investments, I think, will likely expand for those near neighbors, for the migration story and other sets of issues that go around that. But whether it will be at a global scale, whether some countries that are not well situated at close proximity to upper high income countries will get those contributions, those transfers, is a very much an open question.
You also raised the point that these countries are not just going to be dependent on higher income countries for transfers. There are things that they can do as well. So any transfers will just be on top of what countries can do for themselves. So it's not sort of a substitution.
Absolutely. I absolutely. I mean, so and transfers alone aren't going to fix this problem. It can be very helpful for adaptation in particular, but countries that have low income, there are typically institutional and historical reasons, colonialism, for example, geographical things you can't do much about, but institutional issues that need to be resolved. Transfers can help with that, or it can actually hinder it. Large transfers into a country with poor institutions or lack of capacity to manage those could make it worse. So you want to have the institutions that are pro-progress, pro-development, pro-assist the poor, I guess, is how I describe pro-poor, is probably the better term, and make sure that they're doing that. That's their focus. Then everything can align. But if some of those things don't align, it may not lead to the desired outcomes, at least in terms of human well-being. So yes, absolutely, individual countries can and do and should do better, but they will need, certainly in the context of climate change adaptation, they will certainly need support from upper income countries to be able to do what's necessary.
Well, this work is very topical, of course, with the threats of climate change, and you've done a great job of getting data from different sources, economic data as well as various survey data on human well-being, and you've come up with some solutions that might help mitigate the problems that we could be facing in the future. So this shows an approach which I think is characteristic of your research throughout your career. You've done a lot of work in resources, the environment. You always seem to get good data sets and you analyze the data carefully. It's clear that economic measurement is a core component of what you do. Yeah. Perhaps you could tell us something about how you choose research topics, or if you have any advice for young researchers, PhD students, early career researchers, thinking about a research topic. Do you have any suggestions for them?
I guess everyone needs to do that's best for them. I can just tell you what I've done, and it's certainly worked for me. I've certainly enjoyed the work that I've been doing. It always starts with a problem, a challenge, or if you will, that motivates the research. So I didn't start with the data for this work that we were talking about. I started, there's this issue about different views about where the world is going. And I said, I think that data could help us resolve that. Is this right or that right? Or maybe, So that was the point, that the problem was there, and it's a big problem, according to what we found. And so then the data then became it's a data-driven process in what we did. And that's true of other work that I've done. Whether it's a drinking water quality, there's a major drinking water quality issue in remote communities in Australia. And that affects First Peoples in general more than people who are non-First Peoples. So it's maybe half the people who are affected by poor water quality in Australia are First Peoples. So that's a very high proportion relative to the overall proportion in the population. So the only way you can respond to that is to have a look at the data, find out where these communities are, and then governments, if they're well-meaning, and we have a federal government that is moving in this, not enough, but is doing things in this space that is good, then they need to have that data and analysis around that data so they can prioritize how they will spend their money. So again, it's dealing with a problem, motivating, using the data and analyses around it to give you some indications of what could be done. And so I see it as a package, the data, the problem, the resolution. I'm not a policy maker, but how you can then think about what are the ways forward that policymakers then will work out how to do it, but they need guidance based on findings. So that's how I work. So it's applied work. It's not theoretical. Typically, it's rarely theoretical. And it's really about a problem that I think it needs to be looked at.
Societal problem,
yes,
where
exactly.
you have potential to make an impact
exactly.
because of the data and the measurement, and if you can improve the measurement, there's an opportunity to do that as well.
Yeah, so typically I've used data that's already is already out there. So in this work that we're talking about, global human well-being, the data's there. We had nothing to do with collecting the data. We just used the data. But in the case of drinking water quality, we've created this database called the Australian Drinking Water Record for communities that are less than 10,000. There's lots of good data for 10,000 plus communities, but not for small communities, and certainly not for those communities of the size of a few hundred. So we've created this database, and it will be released in 2026, and that, I hope, will start to lead to better outcomes. Communities will understand what the quality of their water is. They will see the trend analysis and then start to make some decisions of what they need to do in terms of advocacy. And governments also can use that in terms of prioritization. We've also done analyses around that as well, which accompanies the data. So those analyses, after controlling for remoteness, after controlling for socioeconomic status, and a few other things, it appears that there's a robust and highly significant factor that helps determine the quality of your water, and that is Indigenous status. Okay, now we can speculate why that is, okay, but the statistical analyses based on the data we have indicates that that is a factor, even after controlling for other things. And then that then leads to, well, what's causing that? And that, again, is a discussion that communities, governments need to think through what it is causing that. And then we hopefully end up with better policies and better outcomes for those communities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Quentin, for your contribution to the conference today. And thank you for all the very policy-relevant research you're doing on topics which are challenging to our society. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been wonderful to be here to talk, present, not only in this interview, but at the conference, which, by the way, is a fantastic workshop. It's really good people, really good discussions.
Thank you, Quentin.
Thank you.